Only if you're ready. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to Divine Enigma, a podcast that talks about how to navigate through the complexities of the workplace as a modern day professional, whilst also having a side hustle simultaneously. We appreciate all of our audience members for taking some time out of their day to tune into another episode and look forward to providing you all with some value through today's show. My name is Sarah and I will be the host for this podcast. This podcast will be available on all platforms where you can find podcasts, including Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Podcasts. Welcome to today's show. I've been away a bit for a bit of a break. I went on holiday, so I'll probably update you on that on another episode. But yeah, welcome back and thank you for listening. Let's get on with the show. Hi, Patience. Welcome to the Divine Enigma podcast. I'm so happy that you're on this podcast, and I just want you to introduce yourself and tell me a bit about what you do and why it's so important to talk about neurodiversity from the perspective of your area of work. So, yeah, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for having me. It's quite an honor to be here. So I'm quite excited about talking to you. So like you said, I'm Patience Udonsi. I work as a lecturer in learning disability nursing and social work at the University of Salford, which is in Manchester. Part of my research interests include neurodivergence, having spent about 15 years in practice working with people with learning disabilities, but also people who are neurodivergent in various ways, whether they're autistic, have ADHD, and various other neurologies. So my interest in this is around creating spaces in different dimensions, whether it's within higher education, whether it's within community health services or social services, whether it's about professional jobs, creating spaces that recognize neurodivergence as a natural part of the diversity of our human nature and being, that neurodivergence is not some sort of odd strangeness, and that we don't attempt to get people who are neurodivergent to fit in neurotypical environments, but actually taking it right back and saying, right, within these spaces where we function or where we get educated or we get our healthcare, are these spaces actually suitable for somebody who's neurodivergent? And if they're not suitable, why don't we do something about it? So that's sort of the angle where I'm coming from at the moment. And most recently, I was working with some colleagues from the University of Westminster, where I was sharing about not just neurodivergence, but also the intersections of where people have other identities that are quite marginalized and stigmatized. And then when you have the intersection of those stigmatized identities, people then face oppression, discrimination at a much higher level than if they just had one peculiar identity.
So I know that your aim is to sort of erase the intersectionality of race and intellectual disability in neurodiversity identities. What do you tend to find, like, with the intersectionality of, for example, being let's look at a very marginal group, a neurodiverse Black female, how are they treated in comparison to maybe a white neurodiverse male, and even in that intersection about how Black males are perceived with their neurodivergent conditions, because it'd be quite interesting to understand it from your perspective and what has happened through the research that you have undertaken to see how, I guess, care professionals can treat people. It's not even just about care professionals, but generally in the whole of society, there is a way that, I guess, Black people are perceived, and also people who have a neurodiverse condition are perceived, and how those perceptions should be changed, or how people can view it in a different way. I hope I've asked the question in a way that makes sense, but yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And it, in as much as it's very difficult to give a generalized answer, but on a basic level, the theory of intersectionality that I write about a lot was first suggested by Kimberly Crenshaw way back in 1984. And she had been doing some work looking at the experiences of Black women within the criminal justice system in America. And what she was finding was that the treatment of Black women was different from the treatment of white women. And when she started to look at the impact of feminism and how feminist thinking and feminist interventions were bettering the lives of white women, what she found was those interventions were not as impactful for Black women. And so Black women were facing a double whammy, so to speak, because on one hand, they were facing gender discrimination, but on the other hand, facing racial discrimination. And what she found out was that, listen, we are not just one thing. You cannot isolate our different parts, but we are a sum of all these various identities. So, for example, the scenario that you've given me, where we've got a Black woman with intellectual disabilities who is also neurodivergent, what you then have there is that whereas if you had a white man who is neurodivergent and has an intellectual disability, what that white man will have as an experience of their oppression will be different from what the woman will experience, because right there, you've brought us to three intersections. So going back to Kimberly's theory, she would talk about sort of bring to mind the picture of an intersection where you've got cars coming from different directions. So in this case, let's imagine we've got an intersection with cars coming from maybe 4 different directions. Yeah. Imagine that woman that you've just described standing in the middle of that road. And then she could be hit by the car of racism.
Yes.
And also be hit by the car of gender discrimination. Be hit by a car around ableism and discrimination against disabled people. And let's also say then that perhaps maybe this person, because of their disabilities, couldn't hold a job down, maybe be hit by another car of poverty. Yeah. So imagine then the compounded impact of those different vehicles hitting that person at the intersection. So when we're talking about things from an intersectional perspective, we're saying that a person experiences a much more greater disadvantage because these oppressions are affecting them simultaneously. Yeah. And what then happens is, if you go back to maths, where you've got the intersecting circles, at the intersection of all these things, we then get interlocking oppressions.
Yes.
They're all connected, but they're interlocking. And they then mean that the sum total of that person's experience is much more disadvantaged than other people in the community. So when that person who is that disadvantaged, for example, interfaces with a health service, let's say they have a health emergency and they needed to go to accident and emergency. When they interface with the health system, all the research and the data that we have currently in the United Kingdom about the outcomes of Black women within the NHS, the poorer health outcomes, the health inequalities, all those inequalities would be much more enhanced, because now they're coming into a space that was not built for Blackness. They're coming into a space that was not built for intellectual disability. They're coming into a space where information is not made accessible, where the systems are quite challenging to navigate around, where the language is challenging to interpret and understand, where there might be medical language, where there might be people speaking at a different level from what this person is used to. So the sum total of these things then mean that their experience is much harder than if a neurotypical white man went to A&E. Does that answer your question?
That does answer the question. So what do you think could be changed around that? Because I think that there's a lot to unpack here. We're looking at all these intersectionalities of race, disability, and a neurodiverse condition. And then on top of that, you're more likely as a neurodivergent to be hit with poverty. So you don't always have access or money to get the best service you want. I mean, I can think of my own personal experience of having a health condition, knowing that this health condition is affecting me, going to my NHS GP, knowing that I can't get help. But because I'm in a, I guess, privileged position, I was able to go, I'm going to go private, because I know that if I keep going to the NHS, it's just going to give me the same answers. I know there's something wrong with me, so I'm going to have to go private. But there are many people that might not have that privilege or that ability to have the money to go to a private doctor to get the help they need. And even with going to a private doctor, I know as a Black woman myself, I even think to myself, will I get that same treatment that someone else would get, being that, I'm a woman of color, even if I do have that money, because even having money doesn't guarantee the same level of treatment that you get, particularly when it comes to the medical services and the health services in the UK or anywhere in the world, if we want to go that sort of deep into it. I mean, what could institutions do to change? Because it is a lot to unpack and there's a lot to kind of think about, because a lot of the time when people are used to doing things a certain way and seeing things from a certain perspective, it is hard to change those mindsets and those attitudes of how Black people or people of color are viewed in the health system, in the NHS for the UK, but in the health sector, and also within the education system as well. So when you look at the education system, even from starting from age 5, when you go to primary school, how the trajectory of how a child's outcomes are expected compared to maybe if you're comparing that with a white child and a Black child, is very different. And I feel like with Black children, they have to go above and beyond and go through these hurdles. Even when as a child, you're almost said you have to work twice as hard to get to half the level they are. And I feel like a lot of the time we need to change those attitudes, but what could change in order for those ideologies to completely change? I know some areas are changing, but there's still a lot of work. And from your sort of professional experience and background, what do you think could change with institutions and how they view that? Because it's not a solution that can be just fixed overnight, but we can start with one area or one thing to slowly get, I guess, a level playing field in terms of everyone is seen not only as equal, but has equity in terms of developing themselves, and also the support systems that should be in place for those who don't have access as well.
I think there are a couple of strands, different strands that are required, because what we're talking about here is structural issues, structural discrimination. And because it's structural, then it filters down to various levels within the society and within community. And all these services we're talking about, the organizations, the institutions, whether it's the National Health Service, whether it's local authorities or business, industry, all these organizations, all these bodies are built on a system. And one of the things that we need to realize, and that we need our government, our policymakers to be able to realize, first of all, is that we have structural racism. First of all. And obviously we had a report last year that was sanctioned by the then Equalities Minister, where she was claiming that racism wasn't an issue in the UK. And quite a number of academics were saying, no, you're wrong. We have a structural issue, and this is a structural issue that actually goes beyond the United Kingdom on its own. It's a structural issue that puts forward whiteness as being the norm. So globally speaking, we have a racist post-colonial system that places whiteness as the norm, and anything that is not white is substandard. And so even if you went to Africa or you went to Asia, there is still this thing where Western whiteness is the norm. And so even with the little ways that people interact or how people relate to each other, there is this pecking order that is coming out of post-colonial history. So once we accept this, that we have a system that is geared to make whiteness the norm, anything else that is black, brown, or whatever color is automatically disadvantaged, because if whiteness is the norm, it means, you know, if you're going for a job interview and you're presenting slightly different, you've got the braids on, you're looking different, or you've got an afro, you are not coming up to the norm, and already you're disadvantaged. You've got a name like myself that is quite different from the average British name. You know, all those disadvantages are already there. So first of all, it's understanding the structural issues. And, you know, one of the things that's been found in research is that any organization that seeks to address racism will, by the same interventions, address every other ism. Where you put things in place to address racism, you will then start to be aware, more aware of social justice and issues around equity. So where we are talking about people within public services being ignorant, not having the right information, if we start to realize that the system has been wired to fail certain groups of people, what will then happen is that these organizations will have targets, they will implement targets, they'll start to look at how do we make this system better. And I really do think education is a big thing, because roll it back 20 years ago, there wasn't as much activism around neurodivergence as we've got now. Roll it back another 30, 40 years, there wasn't as much activism. Certainly around racism, we all know that when we had the Black Lives Matter protests, it really sensitized a lot of people around issues of race and racial discrimination. And now we're starting to have that activism as well around neurodivergence. And we're starting to hear people coming out who are neurodivergent, like yourself, and saying, I identify as this because I have this condition, and that doesn't mean I'm ill or I need to be corrected or I need to be made to fit in with the system. It means that the system that was wired to favor neurotypical brains now needs to be rewired to accept that neurodivergence is a natural part of life. So I think education and activism, we need people who are able to carry these causes and start to agitate for social change. I know this, a man called Nick Walker, who's been doing a lot around neurodivergence. And he says things like, you know, within racism, sometimes we refer to, white privilege, which is the privilege of a white person to never actually think about making an adjustment and thinking about how to ensure that the space is not racist, because they've never had to think about these things, because these things have never happened to them. And what Nick Walker talks about is neurotypical privilege, which is the privilege of neurotypical people to carry on with their lives as if nothing has happened, as if neurodivergent people don't exist. And he starts to call that out and says, listen, you know, if you're neurotypical, you ought to be using your privilege for the greater good. Use your privilege to start to open up the spaces so that neurodivergent people feel at home within that space. So I think we need education, but we also need activism. We need people who are social justice champions who are going to be coming out and doing this. And then, of course, we need some trailblazers in the different systems and the organizations that we have, where we need to be able, sometimes for some people, they can't really imagine what it's going to look like. And so we need to have some examples where we are saying, oh, look at such an organization. Look at this university. They have been able to rearrange their buildings so that their buildings are taking into account people's sensory integration. The buildings are more tuned in to lighting, to noise, to color. So we have these exemplars, services that people can start to hold up as, look at this example. This is what it looks like when we're talking about responding to these intersections and interlocking oppressions. These are examples of what it looks like when we have a society that creates a standards of equity and there isn't any sort of ignorance and, going on autopilot as if, your specific neurology is the only neurology that deserves to be on planet Earth and everybody else should be forgotten, that sort of a thing. So those are some of my ideas around it.
Since you've been working and studying a lot on intersectionality of race and neurodivergent conditions, I remember when I went to, I think you had a conference with Westminster University, I'm sure it was, and you gave it like a case study about a young Black boy with autism. Do you want to kind of talk about that case study on the podcast so people can kind of understand what happened and what your part was and where the local authority services failed this family due to this boy's autistic condition?
Yeah, so it was kind of the convergence, like I said, of quite a few factors coming together, which landed him in this position of disadvantage. So this was a young person whom I worked with. I met at the age of 18, whilst I was working within a role as a behavior specialist nurse. And he had been referred to our service because he was quite distressed and had been displaying quite a lot of behaviors that people in school and obviously parents at home were finding to be quite challenging. So you'd hit her, he'd kick, he'd run away from his carers if he was within the community. There were various behaviors. He wasn't really sleeping well. And he had got to the point where there'd been an incident with his dad in the kitchen where the kettle had been boiling, and some kettles whistle when they get to that boiling point. And at that point, he was overwhelmed by the sensory input from the kettle. We later assessed him as being hypersensitive to sound. But anyway, he took the kettle with the boiling water and threw it on his dad's back, leading to some really extensive burns. But what that did was, obviously, it caused a lot of hurt for him, for his dad, but also it diminished the help and the support that was available for him at home. So because mom and dad would support each other to look after him, so all of a sudden his support was diminished. But what then happened was also that the family had been given a budget by the local authority as a direct payment that they were expected to manage without any input from social workers. So they'd only have like a review once a year. But in between that time, the family would have to find a suitable service to support their son, take them out maybe at the weekends, take him on community access activities and things like that. So it was down to the family to find a suitable service for that. So the family had found a service with their limited knowledge, number one, of their son's condition, because actually nobody had taken the time to educate them around autism, presentations, and, some of the challenges that their son was facing and how these challenges could be overcome. So they recruited this organization that didn't have experience in working with autistic young people. And this organization took him on an activity, which, of course, he loved, swimming. But that swimming activity was not planned with his neurodivergence in mind, because the staff didn't really know what they didn't know. So they took him on this outing as part of a group of 10 disabled people. They took them to a swimming bath in the community on a Friday evening where it was quite busy. A lot of children, a lot of young people. So he had a lot of noise. And mind you, he loved swimming. So obviously he was overstimulated by the activity that he loved. And the end result of it was that he ended up assaulting a child in the changing areas, not because he was intentionally assaulting this child, but he'd gone into the changing room and this child was drying their hair with a blow dryer.
Okay.
And so he went to kick the dryer, but obviously kicked this child's head and it led to an injury. But how did he get there? When we started to unpick it all, we realized that actually this family hadn't had the support that they needed. And again, it was an intersection of things. So first of all, this young person had intellectual disabilities, really nonverbal communication.
Yeah.
And so there was lacking an assessment of what is it exactly that was distressing him. There wasn't any assessment really specifically picking out what were the functions of his behavior. So when he kicks you, why is he kicking you? He's not just kicking you for fun, but what is going on for him? Because sort of within my profession, when we talk about responding to behavior, we'd always say every behavior has a function. Yeah. It's communicating something. It's telling us something. But our homework is to find out what the person is trying to tell us. So for this young man, there'd never been that homework done in terms of determining what were the functions of his behavior. And then because he was autistic, there had not been an assessment around his sensory integration. So how do his senses receive information from the environment? And we know that sometimes people can have undersensitivity or oversensitivity. So in his case, he had an oversensitivity to noise, which meant that noises that didn't affect other people would overwhelm him, because there'd be this accumulation of the noise. And then that would push him to the point where he'd have to react. And that reaction could be hitting, it could be kicking. Yeah. So for somebody else, it might look like it's come from nowhere. So for that young person, what we were seeing was that intersection of having an intellectual disability, not being able to articulate how he's feeling, what he's thinking, what he's experiencing, what he's seeing, not being able to communicate his distress, not being able to say, I'm not okay, I'm overwhelmed. This place is too noisy, or the lights are hurting my eyes, or I'm getting a migraine, not being able to articulate that. And then the intersection of the neurodivergence, where, living in a neurotypical world, where everything is turned up too loud, where the routines are not clear, where it's not always clear what is being expected of you, where people don't always communicate in a way that you can interpret, where there is this level of anxiety that stays with you every single day, and you are unable to actually resolve the anxiety because you've not been taught the skills in terms of how to resolve that. So he had the intersection of that neurodivergence. And then from a race perspective, being the son of first generation migrants who had come from Africa, being expected to navigate a system that they did not fully understand. And these assumptions that Black people look after their own, where families are left to look after their own, even when they actually need intervention, they need professionals to step in. And also that side of recognizing that cultural fluency and cultural competence, where services that are mainly manned by white British staff start then to be flexible enough to respond to working with people who are not white British, and thinking, oh, well, if she needed help, should have told us. Yeah. Oh, well, if she was struggling, should have said. Not acknowledging that actually, no, from their personal experiences and their culture, it is not within the culture to sound like you're exaggerating your child's condition, because all the while you've got to downplay it, where autism could be, interpreted in many divergent ways, where it could actually maybe be a spiritual problem that needs prayer, or it could be stubbornness that needs discipline. Acknowledging these things, that they are different ways of viewing the scenario. So how can we help this family so that our service is not just for a white British family? So there was that intersection then. So when you put all these intersections together, we have a family who had a really complex young person to look after, a young person who needed help, who didn't get timely help until there was a tragedy, an incident that happened. And when you look at why it happened, it was that intersection of the intellectual disability, the neurodivergence, and really it's racism. Because if a service cannot meet the needs of racialized and minoritized people, then we've got to be able to hold our hands up and say, this is racism.
Yeah, I agree. I'm thinking about the situation of this young person, and I think when I think about my own background as an African, first generation African, so my parents are both of first generation African descent. If when I was younger, I suspected that I had dyslexia, and I wanted to tell my dad, should I tell the school that I think I have dyslexia? And he's like, no, don't tell the school you have dyslexia. We don't want you to be labeled anything like mental health or a health condition. We don't want you to label you for that. We don't want you to see you as that label. And I never understood it as a young child. I just thought, I think there's something wrong with me. Should I not tell the teacher? Should I not tell the doctor? And it was always this thing, we don't want you to be labeled. And I think a lot of African families have this fear that their children will be labeled, and they're gonna have a difficult time, because not only that they're black, but they have this other thing, dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia. We don't want you to be labeled. We want you to get through the system without any problems, because already, in a way, being black is a problem. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I feel that was kind of my experience growing up as a child in the UK, that we're always afraid to place labels on ourselves where we already are.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's a valid thing, because it's part of our culture and how we've been raised to emphasize the positive and downplay anything that appears in our estimation to be reducing the standard of our intellect. And because being intelligent and, being academically successful is a huge thing in some of our African cultures. It's really important to be successful. It's important to do well. Your parents take pride in the fact that you've done well academically, or you've gone and done great things. You've got your degree, your undergraduate, your master's, you're this, you've got a great big job. And, that's the pride of your family, your extended family. Everybody, it takes pride in that. And, when you think about the intersectionality theory that we've been discussing, in a way, they have a point, because if my blackness is already disadvantaging me, if I then have another label, that's enhancing the disadvantage. But I guess what we sometimes overlook is the fact that when a condition is undiagnosed, it then follows that we don't get the appropriate support that we need.
Yeah.
And so we run away from the diagnosis, but then it then closes the door on help. I find that scenario even at the university, where sometimes I have to sit down with minoritized and racialized students and say, have you considered having an assessment for dyslexia? I remember last year sitting with one of the students that I'm a personal tutor for and saying, have you considered having an assessment for dyslexia? And she's like, all the stuff about, I'm not disabled. There's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah.
And when it's like, because there's always been this ableism that goes on, where having a disability is really something that people get stigmatized for. And people have grown up being told that you're thick, you're not intelligent, you're stupid. And so if somebody says you have dyslexia, then is that then confirming that you're stupid?
Yeah.
And because of all these pejorative terms, and that's one of the things we find about neurodivergence, that for a long history, a long period of time, it's been presented in really a pejorative way, where there's not that acknowledgement that, look, our brains are not the same. We have different neurologies. Even the people who identify as being neurotypical, even with that, within their neurotypical brain, there are elements of divergence. There are elements of, really unique ways of wiring. So because we've got this long history of being pejorative towards difference, it then means that it is much harder for people to accept the diagnosis. However, whenever I've spoken to people and they then understand where we're coming from and they go off and get an assessment, it's like, I can see clearly now the rain is on, because, all of a sudden, all that stuff that made succeeding so hard, that made studying and getting academic outcomes so difficult, all that makes sense now. And you understand how your brain works, and you see the difference that you've used, let's say, pale yellow paper, and the words are no longer jumping around on the paper.
Yeah.
You've used green paper, and all of a sudden the words are clear, and it's just that little adjustment. Instead of trying to type your essay, you've used speech to text software, and you've produced work that was really clarified and well presented. So I think for a lot of our African families, it's again that education, that being exposed to actually the fact that we are divergent. We all have a natural diversity within human existence, a diversity that when we acknowledge, we realize that every single brain is wired differently, and that a person is dyslexic doesn't mean they're less than a person who's not dyslexic. And I think once people have that information, it empowers them and enables them to be able to get the support. However, it still doesn't solve the issue of racism and discrimination. So
No.
I think people, we still have a way to go, but when we start to acknowledge these things, it puts us in a much better position, because indeed, the more conditions you have, the more, like I was saying, you will have more vehicles coming at you at that intersection.
What would you say to maybe employers or like institutions, like educational institutions, and also the health sector, where I feel sometimes just to make those changes, it feels like you're pulling teeth. It feels like a lot of effort for them. They feel like, why now we've got to put this in place. We have enough policies in place. Why do we have to? And I think maybe the way I'm saying it's quite controversial, but it's just sometimes I get this sense that people feel it takes a lot of effort for them to try to make those adaptations for people who have neurotypical issues with them or neurotypical conditions. I think in a sense, if you have like a visual disability, say you're in a wheelchair, I'm not saying it's any better, but sometimes it's almost easier because you can see visually what's wrong with somebody because they're clearly on crutches or in a wheelchair, or there's something visual you can see that, okay, we should put a ramp in the building so they can get past it, or we should put a lift. Whereas with neurodiverse conditions, it's not always apparent. And so I feel sometimes within the workplace and also within the education system and health sector, it's not always effort's not always put into it because people feel like, well, if I can't see it, why try? I mean, what do you think on that? And that's, I think, generally my experience of be a neurodiverse woman, I've had to, I guess, find mechanisms to find my way around a system that wasn't built for me. But not everyone that has a neurodiverse condition can do that. So what can you say to something, or to institutions that feel like it's too much effort for them?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I know that does go on. And even parents with young children who are neurodivergent will often share that, that if you go across to Morrison's and you're shopping with your autistic or child with ADHD, and people look at them and they start, tutting about your, spoiled child,
Yes.
because they cannot see the disability. So it's like an invisible presentation. And it's that thing for me that within the UK, within England and Wales and all that, we have legislation about this. This is the law. It's not like a lovely suggestion. It is the law. If it's not done, then the law's been broken. And that's where we need that activism, where we need people who are empowered to speak up and say, this hospital department is breaking the law. We have the Equality Act 2010, and that outlaws any form of discrimination over, any of the protected characteristics. And one of those protected characteristics is disability, which, neurodivergence at the moment, according to our law, can fall under that category. So we're saying, if I'm coming to work in this work area, we also have, the health and safety at work laws. We have laws around the office being a place that doesn't cause us harm, that is not affecting us psychologically, mentally, and in every way. So if the law that we have demands that public buildings have a ramp outside so that if somebody has a wheelchair, they can access the building. The law demands the same for neurodivergence. So we're not asking for the physical ramp, but we do need that ramp that turns this space where I am working or this space where I'm accessing into a place where a neurodivergent person is able to function without being harmed. So it's a matter of upholding the law.
Yeah, I agree. I just feel like it's almost easy to kind of sidestep someone based on an invisible disability rather than a physical disability, and the law is there to protect you from that. So thank you for that. I wanted to kind of sort of close the podcast on race and intersectionality within neurodiversity, just to go into that in a bit more detail, and how what can we do to change that? I mean, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you think there's a movement more towards neurodiversity and race? Do you feel like there are things that institutions can do to make that better? Because there is a lot to kind of unpack in terms of, all right, I'm dealing with the fact that I'm Black, then I have a neurodiverse condition. How can we create spaces to ensure that people feel comfortable not only with their neurodiverse condition, but also comfortable with the fact that they are Black, they are a person of color, and they carry this, and it's okay? Can we have discussions about it? How can we make that a more positive thing rather than seeing it as something negative? Because at the moment, I feel like there are conversations about it, but where can we move forward? What is the conclusion from that? How can we make it feel like I'm a Black person, I'm a Black woman, and I'm neurodivergent, and I'm proud, and I want people to know this? How can we encourage those who may be listening to this podcast feel like they can be proud enough to tell their employer they have this condition, and on top of that, they're Black, or a person of color? Yeah.
I definitely think it's uncharted territory at the moment, and this is one of the reasons why it's my research interest, because when I've been doing literature searches and doing some reading, I've not really found anybody who is focusing on the intersections of neurodivergence and race. But I've found that there is an emergent voice around the intersectionality of neurodivergence and sexuality. So you hear of books like Neuroqueer Heiresses, but not from the intersection of race and neurodivergence. So I think this is why people like myself and people who work in academia from time to time will then start on a specific research pathway, because you realize that you've got an important subject that is not being given the airtime that it needs. And in a way, that's why I was saying to you, I'm quite thankful for your podcast, because we do need to get the message out. And it's still really in the early stages, but the more of us are aware, the more of us are educated enough within the neurologies of neurodivergence, where we begin to start to reverse some of those pejorative attitudes that place neurodivergence under that umbrella of, not normal, abnormal, strange, and this and the other, or less than. When we start to address that with science and, anatomy and physiology, and start to show that actually neurodiversity is a natural form of human biodiversity. And once people start to understand that, it changes the conversations. And if we have more and more people from racialized and minoritized backgrounds like yourself who are out there, sounding the trumpet and starting this call to action, in another couple of years, the momentum will build like every other thing. If we go back to, the history of how, for example, the global South came out of colonialism, it started with some people saying, we've had enough of this. You go to America with the civil rights movement, it always starts from somewhere with a group of people who say, enough is enough. And then they shine the light on that specific issue. And then before you know it, in another 5 years, it snowballs and then it starts to take off. So I feel quite confident that, we've started, we're at the beginnings of it. There are other people starting to do this as well. So let's keep the momentum. And the more of us do this, the more then we will have more people being able to step into that space and be saying, my brain works differently, and I'm pleased about that, because this is what it is, and I'm great because, for example, if you're neurodivergent, you can step out and say, you know what, I'm great at staying on task. I'm great at focusing on this particular thing and, running with it. I'm great at not being distracted or making small talk and wasting time, within a work environment. You got me. You've got a staff member who's not going to stand by the photocopier gossiping because I haven't got that capacity. My brain works differently. Do you see what I mean? Once we know our strengths and you know what this presents as, those conversations go on and more people are drawn into that space. And then we start to see that equity.
And the last thing I want to do, and I always do this with some of my guests as well, just mention 3 positive things about being neurodiverse and 3 positive things about being a Black woman, because we're going to talk about intersectionality of being Black and neurodiverse.
Yeah. So in terms of being neurodivergent, obviously we have quite a number of different neurologies, a lot of difference, whether people are autistic or they have attention deficit hyperactive disorder or they're dyspraxic or dyslexic. There are so many different neurologies, but I would say, when you look at it, if we didn't have neurodivergence, how boring would the world be? We would lose, that richness of diversity. Anything diverse is better than something that is just one standard, because we're not robots. We are beings who express ourselves in different ways. If we lose neurodivergence, we're going to lose some of the most creative minds that we have in the world. So we've got some creativity going there. If we lose neurodivergence, we will also lose some of that hyper focus on specific things. We've heard of autistic people who have done great work in architecture, great work in engineering, great academic work, simply because of how their brains are wired. So those are my 3 things in neurodivergence. As a Black woman, what is great about being a Black woman, again, the fact that we are bringing diversity into the space. So the world is not all about white men. As Black women, we are bringing our unique beauty. We are bringing our unique cultures that really enrich society. So, for example, within my workspace, having us Black women here means that from time to time, staff are going to be eating some really nice food, because we come up with, exotic recipes. We also have the fact that, as Black women, a lot of us have been raised with the philosophy, which in Southern Africa we call Ubuntu. And I know Ubuntu exists in all the different African communities. And what Ubuntu is about, is something that Nelson Mandela used to talk about a lot. It's that understanding that I am because we are. So it's not all about climbing your way to the top, but it's about enriching the collective. It's about solidarity. It's about building connections. It's about having a community of people, forming a circle around you and saying, we've got this together. It's, being mothered by communities of mothers, whether you're in a workspace, professional space, whether in spiritual circles or religious circles. We're quite good at that as Black women. We're quite good at nurturing. And, those are some of the great things about us.
I love that. Patience, thank you so much for coming to Divine Enigma. Your wisdom and your intellect on this matter of intersectionality, of being Black and being neurodiverse is so rich. And I'm just so happy that you've come on the podcast. It's been a privilege to have you on the show. Just before you go, do you mind sort of leaving your details, email address, that anyone could just contact you if they wanted to know more about your research?
Yeah, Sarah, thanks again for having me. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. So people can contact me on my work email, which is p.udonsi@salford.ac.uk. p.udonsi@salford.ac.uk. And I'm quite happy to respond to emails.
I'll put the details in the show notes for anyone who's listening to this podcast. Thank you so much again, Patience. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Take care. Keep doing what you do.
I just want to tell you about my coaching plan, in which I offer a 6-week coaching program for neurodivergents as well as neurotypical professionals who want to improve their career prospects or get into project management, which is the area that I currently work in. I'm also going to be helping people who want to take the Prince 2 practitioner exam, because I failed the exam many times, but I've now managed to pass the exam and I'm now studying Agile PM right now. So if you'd like to learn more about this, please go to the Divine Enigma website, which is divineenigma.org. Or you can go and send me a quick message via email, which is hello@divineenigma.org. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning more about neurodiversity, the intersectionality of neurodiversity and race. And I would like you to follow me on all platforms where the podcasts are uploaded. Also, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. All the links are in the show notes. And just to thank you so much for listening to Divine Enigma. And if you got to the end of the podcast, you are in a safe place for project managers and professionals to give you the tips and tools on how to navigate the complexity of being neurodiverse in the workplace. I will see you soon. Take care.